Bonjour, bon dia, buongiorno, good morning or good evening, according to the point of the world where you stay. So this is now session number 7 of our webinar. And I will let Lisa make the presentation of our guest today. And so this webinar is organized by 3 persons, Lisa Giombini, Maria Beatrice Sereno, and myself. So it's a three country organization between Italy, Brazil, and France. And we try to mix people from all these countries and other countries too, and from musicology and philosophy to have this discussion together. So I will give the word to Lisa to introduce maybe our session of today.
Hi everybody, welcome to be here. I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker, who is Matteo Ravasio from Peking University in China. And Matteo is assistant professor at Peking University Schools of Arts. He has obtained his PhD in philosophy from the University of Auckland and works on various topics in aesthetics and the philosophy of art, with a special focus on the philosophy of music. Some of his more representative publications include Appearance, Emotionalism in Music, Analysis and Criticism. It was published in the Journal of Aesthetics, Aesthetic Education. And another paper is on evolutionary explanations of musical expressiveness in eventual aesthetics and engineering human beauty in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy. So Matteo will be talking today about improvisational mistakes. Matteo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa, for a nice introduction. Can you hear me? Just check.
Yes, no problem.
Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, it's good. So so today I'm going to talk about mistakes in improvisation and the supposed value of imperfections and mistakes in improvised musical performance. So here's a plausible normative claim: mistakes, flaws, mishaps, and other accidents and imperfections in performance are not as bad in improvised musical performance as they are in work performance. Why is that? Well, the obvious motivation is it's difficult to make music spontaneously, so improvised music. So this justifies more leniency towards the performer. So this is fairly straightforward kind of claim. A more controversial claim that I'm going to discuss today, that perhaps mistakes and imperfections are part of what makes improvisation interesting and valuable. So they're just, they're more than just something that we tolerate because of the particular circumstances under which improvisations are created. So the question is, how do mistakes and imperfections contribute to the value of improvised performance if they do so? Like, I'm not going to claim that I'm going to give you a conclusive answer to this question in this talk, but I'm going to discuss some views that relate to this and propose a distinction that I think is helpful on the way of answering this question. So this is the plan. I'm going to draw 2 preliminary, pretty quick and straightforward distinctions between product and process values and formal versus genetic imperfections. Then I'm going to discuss Andy Hamilton's aesthetics of imperfection, which is centrally related to this claim that imperfections and mistakes are potentially something valuable in improvised performance and in musical performance in general. And then I'm going to discuss some claims made by Alessandro Bertinetto on improvisational mistakes and how they work in improvised musical performance. Towards the end of the talk, I'm going to introduce this distinction between first and second order mistakes and explain what that is and why I think it's interesting and it matters. So product and process values. This is a distinction introduced by Andrew Kania. It's fairly straightforward. So product values are the elements of the performance that can be evaluated independently of how the performance came to be. So they have the same features that would contribute to the value of a composed work, for instance. So things like unity, coherence, originality, whether you respect certain rules of composition, if you think that they hold in that particular context, and so on. So process values, on the other hand, are those values that we can attribute to a performance only once we know something about the way that the performance came to be, was originated. So is it a rehearsed performance, or is it an impromptu performance, an improvised performance? There are certain values that we attribute to performances only under the condition that they were produced in a certain particular way. So a way to capture the distinction in product values focus on the performance in the sense of a sound event, and they bracket every question related to how it came about. Process values focus on performances as an action with a particular history, and so on. And relatedly, if you look at the negative side of this, you have a distinction between formal versus genetic imperfections. So formal imperfections are flaws in performance that do not depend on knowledge as to how the performance came to be. And genetic imperfection can attribute it to a performance once we know something about the performance as an action. So, and say to make an example from a different domain. So you have, say, a guitar that looks like this with a kind of vintage mark and kind of look, and you could think of like how these particular configuration came to be, and if that kind of consideration matters to the attribution of this. So to considering this a flaw in the guitar, then we're talking about the genetic imperfection as opposed to something that's merely a formal imperfection. So Bob Ross, famous American TV personality who was teaching people how to paint, and was famous for saying things like, "There are no mistakes, just happy accidents." Why am I talking about Bob Ross? Because I think this is an interesting, it's an effective way to capture what the first author that I'm going to discuss in the talk, so Andy Hamilton, it's a way to capture the view that is opposing. So this view is a view that considers mistakes as something that we must forgive. So Bob Ross was teaching lay people how to paint, so of course he would make mistakes, but in the spirit of a TV personality and wanted to popularize painting and so on, he would have this kind of positive attitude and say, no worries, you put a brush stroke where it didn't belong, you're going to turn it into a tree or a happy cloud or whatever. So this is the kind of attitude, the kind of obvious attitude towards mistakes in improvised performance that I talked about at the start when I said there are obvious reasons why you would be lenient with an improviser when it comes to mistakes, because it's just very hard to create music impromptu. But so the limit of the Bob Ross attitude is that this attitude doesn't explain the value of mistakes and imperfection. It explains why we should be lenient with painters and with amateur painters, and it explains, if applied to jazz or other improvised performance, why we should be lenient with improvisers. But it does not explain why mistakes and imperfections are valuable. So I take it that Hamilton wants to go past this view and say something more, so that there is a positive value in imperfection. So it seems to me that Hamilton's aesthetics of imperfection can be summarized in 3 central claims. I'm going to discuss 2, what I take to be the 2 central ones. I think the third one is well, it's unrelated to what I'm going to talk about today, and I think you could get can accept the first 2 without accepting the third one. So the 2 central ones are that the first one, that in improvisation, imperfections are not just tolerated, but they are source of value. So that's the sense in which Hamilton goes beyond the Bob Ross attitude towards mistakes. So this is a representative passage. I now argue against Gioia that imperfections is not a means to an end, but contributes to the value of the whole. Thus, the Japanese aesthetics of wabi-sabi involves object-specific appreciation, acceptance, aging, and mark on a bowl enhances its value. So Ted Gioia's view was one of these sort of tolerance views of mistakes in improvised performance. The idea is that jazz performance is going to have mistakes and imperfections, and that's just how it is. So that's the first claim. And the second claim is that an aesthetics of imperfection involves a positive attitude towards contingencies in the creative process, and in fact strives for these contingencies. I'm going to look at the two claims in detail and what I think is a relation between them. That is to say, it seems to me that Hamilton holds that the first claim follows from the second. And the third claim that, as I said, I'm not going to discuss is that an aesthetics of imperfection should extend to all musical performance. So there's this idea in Hamilton's writings on the topic that an aesthetics of imperfection embraces improvisation and the performance of composed works, of scored works or compositions. So it's an aesthetics of performance in general and not just of improvised performance narrowly. So the first claim, imperfections are valuable. So we saw in the passage in the previous slide, this analogy with wabi-sabi, Japanese wabi-sabi aesthetics. And as far as I understand, it's especially the sabi part that is relevant to this. So that's this aesthetics that values imperfections, asymmetries, the aging of certain objects, a certain patina that objects acquire, small cracks and whatever other tiny formal flaws in these objects, whether mundane or larger and more important ones. So it seems to me that there are some issues with the wabi-sabi analogy if we want to apply it to musical performance. Let's say it's not a straightforward application. The main problem, it seems to me, is that imperfections are quite clearly not the focus, not the central focus of appreciation in musical performance, even in improvised performance or say in jazz performance, whereas they clearly are the focus of appreciation in the case of the supposed central example or paradigmatic example of aesthetics of imperfection, there's to say wabi-sabi aesthetics. So take, for instance, this remarks of Kyoto residents regarding this Japanese temple that was burnt in a fire and then was rebuilt, and in 1987 finally covered in gold leaf according to the original plan. And of course, the result just lacks that kind of patina that gold leaf would acquire in in several decades or even longer. So the old-time residents of Kyoto complained that it would take a long time for the building to acquire sufficient sabi to be worth looking at again. So imperfections is not just they're what you focus on in the context of wabi-sabi aesthetics. They're what is valued in the object. And it seems to me that this doesn't carry over but very clearly to the musical case. So it might be plausible to think that imperfections contribute to the value of the musical whole, but we would need it seems to me, a more detailed defense. So what's the value of the whole? How do imperfections contribute to it? So that was the first claim. The second claim is what I call improvisation is problem finding. This problem finding expression is from Keith Sawyer. It's not Hamilton's expression. So Sawyer writes that improvisation is characterized by an emphasis on problem finding rather than problem solving. Right. So I think I take it that's similar to Hamilton's claim that imperfectionism, so this aesthetics of imperfection, is a constant striving for contingencies to respond to, the attitude to contingency is this attitude of open, spontaneous response. So these are two quotations that I think are crucial to understand this second claim, the second crucial claim to the aesthetics of imperfection. Again, I think there's several authors who stress something like this. So, for instance, E.B. Brown has this idea that there are two sort of regulative ideals in the activity of the improviser. So improvisers are simultaneously committed to the spontaneous creation of formally interesting musical structures and they're committed to taking risks in the creation of such structures. So there's this idea of the improviser as a musician that moves in a high risk environment and doesn't try to get out of that particular situation of high risk, but rather is committed to creating music under those particular circumstances. Now, you can accept this, but it doesn't follow from this second claim that that improvisations are valuable. So it doesn't seem to me that claim 1 follows from claim 2. So that's the 2 claims again, just to look at them again. So the first claim was that imperfections are not just tolerated, they are a source of value, of aesthetic value. And the second claim was that in improvisation and in all these imperfectionist contexts, you strive for contingencies to respond to. Again, the claim 1 is presented as following from claim 2. It seems to me the passage here, I'm not going to read the whole thing, is the one where the entailment is presented in the clearest way. But it seems to me that it's not. This is not obvious. So you could think of mistakes as some of those contingencies that we strive for. And then you might think, well, then the claim holds. But then the whole idea becomes a bit implausible, because it is doubtful that we actually strive for mistakes. So whatever those contingencies are, they couldn't just be mistakes with no further qualification. There would have to be some particular kind of mistake, because certainly we don't strive for mistakes in performance, in any kind of performance. But you could think of other contingencies that we respond to. So sometimes we do things in improvised performance that we weren't quite expecting, like we surprise ourselves. So, or of course, if we are playing with other people, they surprise us, and so we find ourselves having to react to these contingencies. So these this striving for this kind of contingencies that we respond to could be satisfied by improvised performances that include really a varying amount of mistakes and imperfections. So wouldn't we prefer those performances that have a relatively low amount of mistakes and imperfections, provided that they strive for, that in those performances we also strive for contingencies and respond to them. So I think that this is captured quite nicely by Andrew Kania, who, I kind of attribute to him this thing that I call Kania's principle, that mistakes and imperfections are pro tanto bad. So of course, they may help in some particular on some particular occasions, but they are pro tanto bad. They're not things that we consider in themselves valuable. So this is the passage where I get the principle from. Surely an improvisation that did not include errors of form or execution, that sounded finished or complete, even though it was a genuine improvisation, would be more valuable than one with an improvised feel due to just such errors. So what's the idea here is that, mistakes could contribute to this kind of improvised feel that we want improvised performances to have. Like in some sense, mistakes in performance, in improvised performance, are a guarantee, or the closest thing that we can get to a guarantee that the performance is generally improvised. So yes, mistakes could contribute to some of the things that we want in improvised performance. But if we had a genuine improvisation that did not include such mistakes, and that at the same time certain qualities of formal perfection, then wouldn't we consider that improvised performance more valuable than one that is improvised and perhaps derives its improvised feel from certain mistakes in execution? So that's Kania's principle. So that's the conclusion of my discussion of Hamilton's aesthetics of imperfection. So it's of course a brief discussion. I'm not I don't want to claim that I've exhausted all of that is there in the series of articles that Hamilton has devoted to this topic. But again, the take-home point is that I'm not convinced by this entailment claim. So it's true that we strive for contingencies to respond to, but I think that the claim that mistakes are valuable and imperfections are valuable doesn't necessarily follow. So I want to look at another author who wrote on the topic. It's a quite interesting article by Alessandro Bertinetto, who starts with an explicit definition of a mistake, which we haven't encountered so far, and he defines mistakes quite generously when it has this quite capacious definition of mistakes as deviations from requirements, norms, and expectations. What's the upshot of this definition? The mistakes are context relative, because of course it depends what the requirements, norms, and expectations are. So there are no mistakes per se. And this upshot is interesting according to Bertinetto because it results in the claim that mistakes may be successfully resolved. So when mistakes are resolved, and now we're going to look at an example of that, when mistakes are resolved, the normativity of the performance has been transformed. So if mistakes are deviations from requirements, norms, and expectations, so they are deviations from normativity, and they may be resolved, and once they are resolved, the normativity of the performance is transformed. So what's an example of a resolved mistake? This is the example Bertinetto uses. Herbie Hancock recollects that when the music was building, the audience was right there with us, and at the peak of Miles' solo on So What, I played a really wrong chord. Miles took a breath and played a phrase that made my chord right. Miles didn't hear it as wrong, but instead as something that happened. So what happened in this this exchange, in this musical performance, was that of course a mistake was successfully resolved. So there was something that deviated from requirements, norms, and expectations, so a mistake by Hancock, and that mistake was resolved by something that that Davis that Miles did, and that made it sound right. So the normativity of the performance has been transformed in Bertinetto's terms. So there's a second claim that Bertinetto makes, and that's supposed to follow from the preceding ones, and that's that a mistake is a mistake only if it is not successfully resolved. Because once the normativity changes, what was originally a mistake becomes acceptable on the basis of this kind of updated normative framework of the piece. Now Bertinetto is ambiguous when he talks about normativity. Is ambiguous between normativity at the general level, like what's acceptable in a style, and normativity in the sense of like the musical order that emerges in a piece. I think this is an intentional ambiguity, and I'm not going to discuss whether that's a problem, but maybe it's worth keeping that in mind. So I think this denial that resolved mistakes are mistakes is a bit puzzling for two reasons. First of all, it seems to me it's in contrast with what we say of mistakes in general. I mean, yeah, mistakes sometimes we can sort of fix them, and we learn from them, and we turn them into something positive. But we wouldn't say that they were mistakes. And the second point, and relatedly, I mean, it's precisely because they actually are mistakes that sometimes the process of resolving mistakes is interesting, and the skills that are involved in it are valuable. Especially in the case of improvised performance, it's the unintentional nature of the mistake that guarantees the spontaneity of the response. So I think there's value in having a conception of mistakes that allows us to say that those actually are mistakes and they remain mistakes, even though we may resolve them. Of course, the denial is motivated by Bertinetto's definition of mistakes as context relative. So, if a mistake is resolved, the normativity of the performance is updated, is transformed, and so it's no longer a mistake. Perhaps as a solution, we could say resolve mistakes that are not imperfections in the formal sense, if you recall that distinction I introduced at the start, but they are imperfections in the genetic sense. So at some point, somebody did something that they didn't intend to play, they didn't intend to do. And in that sense, they are mistakes. But because the normativity of performance has changed, these are no longer imperfections in the formal sense. So that's a way to, I think, to have it both ways, as it were. So here's the final part of the paper, and this distinction that I wanted to introduce between first and second order mistakes. And it's really inspired by a distinction introduced by Randall Dipert, who was writing actually on a quite different topic. They say that the historical performance practice and composers' intentions, this kind of stuff. So he argued that it is useful to classify composers' intentions according to these three levels. So you have low-level intentions related to performance means, like play this chord with this fingering and so on. Middle-level intentions, so produce certain auditory experiences. And then high-level intentions, so certain effects that the composer intends to achieve. So his famous example is this: when Gluck used the clarinet, perhaps he wanted to startle an audience because it was a relatively new instrument at the time, right? So he would want to state a musical line using an unfamiliar instrument, right? So Dipert writes, if today we perform a work of Gluck's with the original scored clarinet, we are preserving his low-level intention, but are sacrificing his high-level one. So you can see how this is going to be relevant to people who are concerned with the historical performance practice and so on, but that's not what we are concerned with now. So what am I going to do with this distinction? Why do I think it's relevant to improvised performance? Well, I think we can draw a more general lesson from this distinction, and it's that when we create music, whether it's in composition or in performance, there is in a sense two things that the performer or composer intends to achieve. First, they want to specify a particular musical structure, so a chord, a note, a phrase, an arpeggio, and so on. And second, they intend that structure to achieve a particular goal, what I call a musical goal. I'm going to have a list of these goals in the next slide. And of course, sometimes you don't have a goal in mind. I'm not saying that this goes on all the time, but I'm just saying this structure that I'm describing here is relevant to capture what is going on at times, at some crucial times in performance. Sometimes you just play, you just play scales to improve your technique. You have no goal in mind, no musical goal. So so here's if that's a lesson you can draw from Dipert's distinction, here's the distinction I want to draw that is relevant to improvised performance: first versus second order mistakes. So there's two ways of being mistaken when performing. So you can make first order mistakes. So you want to play a musical structure, but you fail to play it. I mean, you just haven't practiced enough. You got drunk last night, or I don't know, your hand slips. And then you have second order mistakes in which you successfully play the structure, musical structures you intend to play, but you do not achieve the goal that you wanted that structure to achieve. So what kind of goal? So that we can also talk about examples of this. You could have an expressive goal, and so you want the music to sound a particular way in emotional terms, and you would think that the particular structure can do it, but it doesn't. You could have functional goals in terms of like I mean something like harmonic functions. You could have stylistic goals. So for instance, it seems to me that when people improvise, very often they think of whether what they are doing is in style or not in style. So what it sounds strange or familiar in that particular style that they are improvising in. And well, at least my experience is that it's very easy to be mistaken about this, and you do something that you think is going to sound in style, but it doesn't, or you do something that you think is going to sound kind of cool and different, but it just sounds commonplace. And so on. You could expand the list of musical goals. I don't claim that this is an exhaustive list. You could have, of course, dynamic goals. Turn it down a notch in terms of like intensity of the music, or give turn it up and give some more intensity, or put more tension in the music. And of course, you could have a perlocution, what I call perlocutionary goals, in the sense of so especially if you think that in improvised performance and perhaps in jazz performance, there's an element of interaction with the audience. You might want to talk of these perlocutionary goals. So you want your audience to react in a certain way, and you may of course be mistaken as to their reaction, and so on. So I don't claim that this distinction is only relevant to improvised performance. It seems to me that you could find it in improvised performance just like you could find it in work performance. But there are some salient differences. Of course, in work performance, second-order mistakes threaten broader performance goals that are established by the work's composer. So presumably there is something like the point of a work or the point of certain passages of the work. So second-order mistakes are much more threatening and dangerous in work performance in that sense. And of course, the performers have a certain leeway in pursuing certain additional goals to the ones specified by the composer, or rather implicit in the work. The thicker the work is, the more limited the space is for these additional goals. So this is the familiar thick distinction developed by Stephen Davis. And then the second difference is that second-order mistakes seem to be quite obviously more interesting in improvisation, because that's where we are more concerned with the impromptu aesthetic choices of the performer. Again, you could push back against this claim. You could think of, actually, we are always interested in the creative effort of the performer, also in work performance. You could just say, we're simply more interested in that in improvised performance. So it seems to me there is a difference there. Now, more to the point of like the potential value of mistakes, it seems to me that if we look at the idea of interesting versus uninteresting mistakes, we can learn some lessons by considering this distinction between first and second order mistakes. So particularly, it seems to me that first order mistakes are very rarely interesting. They may be formally interesting in the sense that it may just be that what you end up doing by producing a first order mistake is formally interesting. That's possible. Maybe you just play the wrong, play a chord that you didn't intend to play, or make some kind of weird noise that that was supposed to be an arpeggio, and that's just formally interesting. It just sounds in a way that is captivating, successful, and so on. But first order mistakes are not genetically interesting. They don't shed light on the performer's aesthetic choices. There's nothing in them that the performer is intended to do, so they don't help us understand what's going on in the process of performance in the performance section of the improviser. And of course, you can accept this, and you can still concede that first order mistakes may also be incorporated into interesting musical structures. So if you think of Bertinetto's game of resolving mistakes, that can happen also with first order mistakes, with both first order and second order mistakes. In fact, it's possible that the Herbie Hancock case that we saw earlier, it's possible that it was a first order mistake. It seems to me. So back to the idea of unresolved mistake, a little bit more on that. As I mentioned, both first and second order mistakes may be resolved in Bertinetto's sense. And in fact, it seems to me we can offer an alternative description of that mistake resolution process. So Bertinetto fleshed it out in terms of like changes in the work's normativity. what one could describe this mistake resolution as is by saying that the mistake contributes to the realization of a subsequent musical goal. So a new musical goal is intended in such a way as for the mistake to be able to contribute to it. Right? So that's the process of mistake resolution. If you look at some claims that Bertinetto seems to make concerning the value of mistakes, though it's not explicit about describing mistakes as valuable, and also does not really address the relation of what he's saying to what Hamilton is saying, which I think is a pity. But it seems to me that some of the claims that Bertinetto makes do not apply to first order mistakes. So for instance, he claims that mistakes reveal aspects of aesthetic normativity. Why does he claim that? Well, because mistakes are defined as things that defy aesthetic normativity, right? But it seems to me first order mistakes do not really reveal anything. They're just things that we don't want to do. That's why they are mistaken, because it's something that the performer did not really intend to do, but it ended up there. So they don't really reveal anything much. In fact, it could be that what you produce as a first order mistake is totally fine in terms of normativity, just like it could be that it's totally unacceptable. And another thing that I wanted to say with regard to this to Bertinetto's framework and view of mistakes is that it seems to me second order mistakes are interesting also when left unresolved. So there's this idea in Bertinetto's paper that it's really the process of mistake resolution that is interesting, that is valuable. And I agree with that. But it seems to me what's interesting about second order mistakes is that, at least from the point of view of the improviser, these things are quite interesting. They show your own musical and performative limitation. This is something that in improvised performance we are interested in. And so I get to the final point, final slide. And as an introduction to this general point I want to make is a point regarding what we call improvisation. So it's a mistake to try to identify norms of improvisation that are valid across the board. And you find a lot of discussion in the philosophical literature about improvisation as a unified practice. But improvisation is not a musical genre, but rather a kind of musical activity, or you could say broadly artistic activity. It's really a way of creating music. So again, it seems pointless to try to identify norms that are valid across the board for all improvised performance. So it seems to me you could say that there's a spectrum of kinds of improvisation, and you have some contexts in which it's reasonable to think that the primary goal of the improviser is that of presenting an audience with a performance that have a high level of musical unity and musical purpose. So musical unity, I mean something like those musical goals that I've talked about earlier. So these expressive goals, functional goals, and so on. You could think of musical unity as something like that, a piece that sort of knows where it's going. In those kind of contexts, you want to keep mistakes at a minimum. But again, improvisation is a name for many different things. So perhaps at the other end of the spectrum, you have a context in which improvisers are primarily interested in testing their creative limits. So in that case, there would be a higher tolerance for mistakes, and perhaps you could say that a performance that avoided entirely mistakes entirely would be considered deficient. A final constraint in this kind of spectrum of cases is that too many mistakes threaten musical unity. So I said earlier, you could think of musical unity as the sort of purposiveness of a piece, the fact that at a local or more general level, the musical goal is going somewhere. The more you make mistakes, the more stuff goes wrong in performance, the more this musical unity breaks down, is threatened. And the problem with that is that the more musical unity is threatened, the easier it becomes to improvise. So goals are absent, they're less well defined, and you're closer to a sort of anything goes the situation. And that's not the situation where the improviser typically wants to be. I mean, it's part of the improviser's general goal that it has to be difficult to create interesting musical structures. It cannot be that really anything goes. So that's a constraint that I wanted to briefly characterize. But it seems to me again that we should think of improvisation as moving in these spectrum of possible cases, and reject the idea that there are norms that are valid across the board. So yeah, so I'm going to stop here so we have time for some questions, and I hope it wasn't too rushed. But thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Matteo. Thank you very much. So maybe you can stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, I'm going to stop.
Okay. So we can start with the discussion. If you have a question, just raise up your hand through the function that you have in Zoom, or you write a question in the chat, and I will give you the floor. So we wait for a while people think.
Yes,
Andy. Okay, Andy has his.
Sorry, yes, I'm a bit slow on the technology front, but well, I had 3 issues which I can explain very quickly, or comments. First, that on the question of how do imperfections contribute to the value of the whole in improvisation compared to wabi-sabi, I'm just thinking of an example Tony Buck gave of from the Necks, when he had he never brings a drum kit. He always uses one that's provided, and usually it's great, but occasionally there's a rather ropey, rather poor quality one. And there was one occasion when there was a very interesting sound on this old kit, which would be considered by most people a defect. But for him, it was interesting and it kind of added value to the performance. So that's one example. The second point is when Carnier says mistakes and imperfections are pro tanto bad, I would say if a mistake, I mean, I agree with Bertonetto that something that, well, mistake is a context relative term. And if a mistake is resolved, it may not be bad, and indeed the performance may be enhanced, as you were discussing. So actually, I'm not very good on Latin either. I'm not very good on any other languages. Mistakes and imperfections are pro tanto bad. I don't know that that's true in this. I mean, that sounds to me like a case where it could be resolved. I mean, this is the whole idea of imperfectionism, that these mishaps or these random events can be sources of material and can inspire, and so they're not bad. And so maybe mistake is not the right term for something you did that isn't intended. I mean, these are unintended or non-intentional things that you might have initially thought was a mistake, and then you realize it turned out not to be a mistake by the way you treat the whole. And the final point just is that when you say the more musical unity is threatened, the easier it becomes to improvise because goals are less defined and the harder to make mistakes, I would say that's improvisation in the sense of making do. That's the negative sense of improvise. So, improvisation is, the way we're talking about it is, a term for, common, it's a respectable way of making music. But, the way that I repair my car because I don't care about how it looks, that's making do. And that seems to be the sense of improvise here, that the more musical unity is threatened, the easier it becomes to improvise. Because You know, there's some methods of improvisation have very defined goals. You know, I mean, there are forms of improvisation that are quite strict in how you're supposed to proceed. So they're not at all like making do. Anyway, that was some points.
Yeah, thank you. No, there's a lot there to think about. Yeah, I guess the point about the constraint thing. So I guess the idea there is that to be moving in this kind of risky environment. I mean, I kind of close to the way that Brown frames the issue. And to be moving in that risky environment, you need to be in an environment when there's a sense of like musical purpose in the way that I describe it, right? And of course, you know, there may be moments in improvised performance when there's nothing like that. I mean, you know, at the start of a piano solo improvisation, well, you can do not really whatever you want, but you know, you have considerable amount of freedom. But then, you know, things start to get more complicated. And if you were in the, you know, always in this kind of like, you know, anything goes kind of musical environment, then it wouldn't be probably interesting to listen to improvisation. It wouldn't be challenging to produce them. So that's the kind of idea that I had there. The kind of environment that the improviser needs to be in is an environment that needs to be, to an extent, well, regimented in terms of its musical structure and goals, and too many mistakes threaten that kind of you know, unity. Can
I just say something about risk? Can I just say something about risky, as you mentioned it? Because I don't think that, maybe there are some kinds of improvisation that are more risky. Free improvisation perhaps is more risky, but I think any form of performance is risky, because there is always the danger of a boring performance. There's always the danger of, you know, a routine performance. I mean, that, you wouldn't say that was a successful performance. You wouldn't say, oh, classical music is less risky. You know, I mean, to me, there is the great risk in classical music of a mundane performance, although that happens in jazz too. I mean, I don't know that it's any more likely to happen in classical music. Perhaps it is slightly, but so I don't agree that improvisation is riskier. Some kinds of improvisation might be, in the sense that the whole performance might just collapse or something, but I'm not sure I agree with that. Anyway, that was just another comment.
Thanks.
Maybe.
Okay, so yeah, there is a question from. Oh, Andy, do you have a follow-up? No.
No, sorry, no. I've said enough.
Okay.
Right.
So we have a question from Leo.
Yes, thank you very much for that presentation. Very enjoyable. I just think I would like to clarify, because the final comment that Andy also commented on, I think we need to make a distinction here, and you do in your presentation too, that there are many different types of improvisation. It's not a genre. And there's a line between what we continually in jazz musicology call more and more extemporization, which is what you're referring to with this regimented, you use the word regimented. I don't know whether I would necessarily use that word, but definitely within a predefined framework, and free improvisation, which people like Derek Bailey try and do. So his goal, Derek Bailey's goal, whether it is possible to do or not is a contentious issue, but his goal is to go in with no preconceived plan and play whatever comes. And by those standards, he's not making a mistake, nor is it boring, but other people might find it boring. But his goal is to just play literally stream of conscious. So just to make that point, delineation between extemporization and improvisation?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. As I said, it's one of the, well, it comes up at the very end of the presentation, but it's one of the things that I think it's important to keep in mind, is this variety of improvisation, or variety in improvisation. And I feel like, you know, most of philosophical literature, at least in the analytic tradition, is kind of focused on, you know, sort of central cases of jazz improvisation. I would say it targets that kind of musical tradition. That there are some exceptions, of course, like I don't know, for instance, James Young and Karl Matheson, I think they have this article on improvisation, on the definition of improvisation, and they make it clear that they aim to include things like Renaissance and Baroque, like diminutions. So there you would have a practice that is, well, I've used that term, but I didn't plan to use it. I was improvising, but I said regimented. So I would say, you know, diminutions. That's a clear example of highly regimented improvisation, in which you're supposed to improvise, but you're clearly not supposed to screw up. And so you know, you want to keep it kind of, you know, tight, and so you're at the opposite end of the spectrum from, like, you know, free improvisation. So and again, it would be very weird if there's you know, the same kind of normative framework that applies across the board in a case like Renaissance diminutions and free improvisation. So yeah, I agree with that.
Laurent?
Yes, thank you for your talk. And just a few points, and some of them have been treated by yourself or with the two questions. The first, to go back, myself as Andy Hamilton, I agree with Alessandro Bertinetto that the mistake suppose a norm system that implies some rules, and a mistake is a deviation from these rules or a non-respect. And to go to the example of Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock, I think that's still a mistake. Well, apparently he did the wrong chord, and the interesting point would have been to know how Miles made it a non-mistake. To me, it's still a mistake, but probably he made it compatible with the norm system, or maybe he changed the norm system in a way that make the whole thing acceptable, you know. But yeah, I think we should consider that it's still a mistake, and there is some ways to make it acceptable in the whole performance. Probably, maybe, I suppose Miles played some notes, maybe the wrong notes of the chord, and he played them in such a way that maybe a melodic way or something that made them acceptable. I don't know, but I would like very much to know, of course. That was the first point. And the second one about the first and second order mistake. I think maybe that's what Andy Hamilton was saying too. I'm not quite sure, but we should make a difference between mistakes and failures, you know. I think maybe your first orders are real mistakes. You want to play a structure, or you want to play a chord, and you don't play the right chord. Of course, it's a mistake compared to your intention, and actually it's a failure. But you know, sometimes I'm a jazz player myself, and I feel that very often, unfortunately too often, that you want to, for example, you talked about the dynamic. You want to develop some kind of dynamic in a solo, and more often than no, you don't succeed in it, but you didn't make a mistake, but actually it's a failure compared to the first intention you had. So yes, I think maybe that would be useful to make this difference between failure and mistake, because that's not exactly the same thing. And about free improvisation and the question of risk or not, in real free improvisation, there is no system norm. That is the definition theoretically of free improvisation. So in theory, I think there can't be any mistake in free improvisation, but it can be probably failures when some things that doesn't work the right way. And finally, I expected that you quoted, because it's very famous, that quotation from Thelonious Monk he was talking about the right mistake and the wrong mistakes. I think that's the right way to put the question.
Yeah, that Monk quotation, I think it's interesting. I would think, you know, if he had some kind of specific kind of mistake in mind in the taxonomy that I've offered, I think that's about second order mistake, right? I mean, in the sense that, like, you know, that may be something that you want an improvised performance to have. I don't see how you would want particularly want an improvised performance to have the mistakes of the first order kind. Like, you know, you want to play what you intend to play. You don't want to make that kind of mistake when you play. You know, sometimes it might happen and it's okay, and maybe you fix it, or maybe it sounds interesting. Most of the times it's just bad. I mean, you know, there's a reason why musicians who improvise also practice a lot, because they want to play what they intend to play. So I would say that the Monk quotation is definitely about, I would say it's probably about second order mistakes, something in that kind of ballpark, as opposed to first order. So that's one way in which I think the distinction is useful. But to go back to another point you raised, I think the reason why I think the distinction between first and second order mistakes is useful is because they relate to the performer's intention. And I think this is a sort of obvious way where to look for things that we call mistakes, like things didn't go as we planned, as we thought they would go, as we intended them to go. That's like what we often call mistakes, you know, elsewhere. But I think, you know, you have cases of, and I borrowed the term actually from one of Hamilton's articles. You know, you could have poor aesthetic choices, right? Which are entirely intentional. So they're not first order or second order mistakes, but they're still bad. So you could play, you could be entirely, you know, aware of what you're doing in terms of like musical structure, and end up with things, you know, with a product in terms of performance that is just lackluster and like uninteresting, or has some other kind of flaw. So I'm not trying to say that the distinction that I've offered is kind of an exhaustive taxonomy of what can go wrong in improvised performance or in any other kind of performance. So there's other things, and for instance, you have this, you know, what I just called poor aesthetic choices that maybe are not mistaken in this sense that involves the performer's intention. They're simply, you know, entirely intentional choices, and things go absolutely according to plan, but they produce something that is subpar or not satisfactory from an aesthetic point of view. So yeah, definitely there's more, you know, there's more categories of things that could go wrong, or even perhaps more categories of mistake that one could figure out. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. It's 6 p.m, so I think we should move on with our second speaker. Thank you again, Matteo, for your talk. I hope you can.
Thanks to everyone.
And thank you for the discussion. So I'm very pleased to introduce here our second speaker of today's session, Andy Hamilton. Teaches philosophy and aesthetic subjects at Durham University in the UK. He's published many books, including Aesthetics of Music in 2007, and Lee Konitz, Conversation on the Improviser's Art, always 2007. And he has published also in the Philosophy of Mind and Wittgenstein. His latest book is Pianos, Toys, Music and Noise, Conversation with Steve Beresford, who was published last year, and his very last monograph is called Art and Entertainment, and it is forthcoming by Routledge. So Henry Hamilton will talk today about jazz as classical music. You can find the handout of Henry's talk in the chat. If you want, I can repost it again, but you find it at the very beginning of the chat, so it should be there. But also Andy will share the screen and you can read it while he's talking. So Andy, you have the floor, and yeah. Please.
Thanks a lot. So I'll just share the screen with the handout. So I'm going to speak from a handout. There is an article. So I did an article with this title, and it was published in a volume of a conference at Padova University, probably 10 years ago or something. And I'm revising it, so I'm having some further thoughts about the topic. And it's quite fairly wide-ranging, but the title is Jazz as Classical Music. And I got the idea of this from a very good article, which I really recommend, by James Parakilas, called Classical Music as Popular Music. And it's a way of understanding, it just made me think, well, you know, each form has features of its rival forms, if you like. So it's a suggestion that jazz can be viewed as classical music. And now let's begin by talking about what classical music is. And another term for Western classical music is Western art music. And jazz is commonly recognized not just as an art with a small a, but as art music. That's art with a capital A. I'm not terribly happy with any of the vocabulary that's used here. Some people might call art with a capital A, or fine art, or autonomous art, or ambitious art. There are various attempts to define it. But I'll say a little about what I think an art is, but I just begin with this quote from jazz historian Scott DeVoe. In the discourse of jazz, the point at which jazz becomes art is thought to be in the move from swing to bebop. For a lot of people, that's the moment at which jazz becomes itself, because it sheds what is conventionally seen as this exterior husk of commercialism. By the way, can everyone hear me okay? Am I not going too quickly? Well, I was trying to go too quickly, but right. So what he says about the discourse of jazz seems to me right, that jazz became an art at that point, and one with a fairly capital A. And that's the point that's often made, that, you know, the bebop musicians had a self-conscious artistic conception. And now that doesn't mean that before then jazz wasn't art. I mean, this is, you know, art is often produced by societies that don't have a system of the arts and don't have a conception of self-conscious art. In fact, most art is not produced by such societies. So, and there's nothing normative. I mean, well, there might be some things you could say, which I won't touch on at the moment. So now, what is an art? An art is a practice involving skill with an aesthetic end that richly rewards, well, I put serious attention. Right. So I usually put aesthetic attention, so I might just put that. Now that's necessary conditions for art. A lot of philosophers would disagree with that. So it's not saying nothing, but it's not saying a huge amount, but it's saying something, okay? And one contrast between classical and one contrast term for classical is ephemeral. So as someone who was brought up in West London in the 1960s and 70s, jazz would have been inaccessible to me if it had been ephemeral. So if it didn't have these features that I'm describing that make it close to classical music, I wouldn't have heard about it, because I heard jazz on the radio in a rather niche kind of location, but the BBC decided that this was aesthetically valuable and worth hearing. So, and that meant that people in Britain could hear jazz that otherwise they wouldn't have heard. They might have heard trad jazz, which was, you know, although that was no longer fashionable when I was growing up, but you know, there were certain popular forms of jazz people might have heard, but they wouldn't have heard the jazz that you'd heard, you know, the modern jazz that you'd heard on Radio 3. By the way, I'm going to talk for half an hour, so I'm not going to say everything that is on this handout. Anyway, so let's think about common descriptions that you hear, or you used to hear. I think you probably still hear them. Jazz is America's classical music. Now, Grover Sales is famous for saying that. And that says that jazz is quintessentially an American art form. It's a kind of classical music, and it's the unique classical music. And that third claim is wrong, because there was American classical music before jazz, although it relied on European models almost exclusively up to Charles Ives, and to a considerable extent after. So my interest is in the claim that jazz is an American classical music, but I'm not going to say any more about the American aspect. Okay, I mean, it's relevant in some ways, but so I'm just interested in the idea that jazz is a classical music, or an art music, which, as I'll say at the end, I think means jazz is or can be art rather than entertainment. And you might think, well, that's news from nowhere. You're not telling me anything there that I didn't know already. But actually, some people object to this way of talking. So we'll come on to that shortly. So is jazz a classical music? Well, what does that mean to say jazz is a classical music? It means three things, I'm suggesting. I mean, or maybe more, but jazz is a serious art form in its own right, despite long association with the entertainment industry. In Adorno's language, it's an autonomous art. It has arrived at an era of common practice, which is codified, studied, and taught in the institutions of higher education. And three, it has a universality and now constitutes an international language which transcends national and ethnic boundaries. So there are other art musics that don't satisfy all of those criteria. Courtly gamelan, courtly classical music from Korea, and so on. Those are art musics, but, well, they don't fulfill the third category. I mean, when I wrote this, you know, I didn't fully appreciate, I suppose, the difficulty of sustaining some of these claims. I mean, these are very difficult claims even to describe, but we no doubt will come back to them. So I'm going to pass over these, well, I'm going to pass over Billy Taylor and Wynton Marsalis. So one of the ways in which jazz is classical music is that it's taught in the academy. So what David Liebman called the apprenticeship system of going on the road with Art Blakey, Miles Davis, or whoever, has been replaced by an academic system, although not, obviously it's not entirely replaced, actually. Another feature of jazz as classical music is that there is a canon. So this is part of the, you might, well, I don't know what you want to call it, the classicalization of jazz, the ready availability on CD of the complete history of jazz from the earliest recordings. And there is a kind of version of the history of jazz. I mean, I haven't read so much on the history of jazz in recent years, but I certainly remember reading people like Conrad Cork and Max Harrison, other, you know, writers and critics saying that jazz, well, they drew analogies between the history of jazz and the history of classical music, so that, you know, you had a compressed version of the history of classical music in the case of jazz, and in the era of post-bop, you have a kind of era of common practice, like there is in classical music, well, perhaps in the 20th century. Now, I just want to say something about, because I've just been thinking about this, and I think this is very important, on the question of the canon, because I'm doing a book on art and entertainment, and one of the chapters is on the canon, and I'm just waiting for people to say, well, you know, most of the chapters aren't on entertainment, but I want to say that these are connected concepts, because the concept of entertainment presupposes that there is not a canon or a test of time. So the idea of the classic, because I'm talking here about, you know, jazz as classical music, the idea of a classic as opposed to classical, and that's something you might come back to, because perhaps I'm running those together, but there are classics such as Laurel and Hardy's short films, but usually it makes no sense. Oh, I would say, well, not just usually, it makes no sense for an entertainer to say, I'm not worried about my lack of an audience, I'm entertaining for posterity. So if somebody says, look, you know, once again, a stand-up comedian gives a performance, it's very poorly attended and people don't laugh, and they throw things at the entertainer. It would not be an adequate reply for the comedian to say, oh, I'm entertaining for posterity, I don't worry. You know, it's the fate of every authentic entertainer to be, you know, ignored in their lifetime. And well, that's no, you can say precisely, no, that's not. Entertainment is of its time, and it's essentially ephemeral, though some cases it persists in, as I say, Laurel and Hardy is an example, and other comedians of that era and so on. Because many jazz players are artist entertainers, and Louis Armstrong is a classic case of an artist entertainer, but Charles Dickens would be another example.
Porque cabeu com os três lá no carro. Por quê? Mas por que vocês têm que estar junto?
I think someone needs to close their mic, don't they? Anyway, okay. Right, so this is an issue about the contrast between art and entertainment. If something if a performer is thinking that their audience might be for future decades, they're declaring an artistic aspiration, really. So this idea of the canon, so that the idea of jazz as classical music is very closely connected to the idea of jazz as not just entertainment. I mean, this might be obvious. Well, in a sense, it is obvious, you know, when you think about it. But what is involved in these obvious statements is not at all obvious. So, you know, these are obvious truths. What they mean, I think, is quite contested. Some people contest the truths, but and there are other features that, you know, affinities between jazz and classical music, the role of critics in creating and sustaining a canon, for example. So let's just say something about defining popular and classical music. So you can see that this needs quite a bit more work. I mean, as I say, it was published, but that doesn't mean, what does that mean? You know, it still could need a lot more work, and indeed it does. So defining classical music, classical and popular, that is classical is one half of a polarity. So I'm not sure that one can define classical music without defining popular music. That is, I think they originate well, possibly the word classical predates the use of popular, but I'm not sure now that one can define them separately. So classical music now means, so if you use the term classical music, rather than saying jazz is a classical music has three senses. Music that possesses a standard of excellence and formal discipline. belonging to the accumulation of art, literature, and humane reflection that has stood the test of time and established a continuing tradition of reference and allusion. That's the most general. I got the generality wrong here. This needs to be moved around a bit. But the second, becoming more specific, classical music means Western art music in general. That sense appeared only as the contrast with popular music developed, and it's the definition understood by the ordinary listener, right? So, you know, the person in the street, if you refer to classical music, this is what they will understand. So they don't think of it in the most general terms. The ordinary listener is not really very familiar with the idea of Japanese classical music, but nor are they very familiar with the third meaning, which is a style period within Western art music, the first Viennese school. So that is where you would talk about the classical style and things like that, as opposed to Baroque, as opposed to Romantic. So it's the first sense I'm concerned with. So that's the sense in which jazz is a classical music. So that's quite important. And here's something that Parakilas discusses. I think he makes this point about jazz, actually. Jazz parallels Western art music and having these three elements, or, well, approaches, shall we say, approaches perhaps, which is early music, authentic performance of works before the time of Bach using period instruments, and the parallel there is repertory jazz, orchestras dedicated to recreating Ellington's music, etc. There's a classical mainstream, Bach to Bartók or something, and in jazz there's a post-bop mainstream, and then there's avant-garde or new music, both of those having existed for quite a while now in their respective genres. Now, this is the most contentious part of my paper. As I've got 10 minutes to go, so let me talk about the critique of jazz as classical music, and this is the objections that are commonly made. And I think this is the most difficult part of the argument. So I've got, well, there are at least three reasons. I think I would say at least three reasons for regarding the tendency as undesirable. So, you know, a lot of people don't like the idea of jazz being referred to as a classical music, or it's more commonly referred to as America's classical music. A lot of people don't like that, and I think there are possibly three reasons. First is that it's maybe elitist. So Bourdieu and others have analysed autonomous art as cultural capital and expression of social status. Knowledge is power, with the capacity to oppress. Now, I don't think this implies that the classics are inherently a bourgeois category and that an alternative people's art is required. So I don't think the classics are merely a bourgeois category, and I don't think it's elitist to deny that they are. So I'm very concerned with this kind of objection because it can lead to, so what I want to avoid is elitism and populism. So I don't like either elitism or populism, and my term for the intermediate, the middle way, is a meritocratic view, but that's not ideal either as a term, but anyway. So I think that this is a populist critique of classical music as elitist. So I don't like it. So classics in all art forms are not the preferences of the elite. By the way, you need to think about, and this is a possible mistake I've made, as I say, there's classical music and the classics. And it may be that I'm moving from one to the other, and there's a problem there. I expect there is, but anyway. So I'm talking here about classics. They're not the preferences of the elite. They are the common heritage of humankind. And there's a very good book by Jonathan Rose called The Intellectual Life of the English Working Classes. And he defends the classics. And he looks at the reading habits of working people in the 19th and earlier 20th century, and sees that and talks about cultural deprivation as a real phenomenon rather than a bourgeois imposition, right? So the classic on this view is the accumulation of art, literature, and humane reflection that has stood the test of time and established a continuing tradition of reference and allusion. So there's quite a common view in humanities departments, certainly in, well, I would say around the world, from my experience anyway, this idea that the classics are bourgeois. It's a bourgeois category. So I don't like that at all. And I think that is itself a kind of, well, there has been the phrase, the trahison des clercs. That's what, you know, we're still seeing this. So now, just one point in defense of that view. So I will defend canon formation, although, you know, I don't think there's such a thing as the canon, but I think there are many canons. But just in terms of preferences, over the course of history, the classics come to appeal to a larger number than the local preferences of popular culture. So if you think about how many recordings Beethoven has sold, well, I would guess it exceeds, you know, Jimi Hendrix. I wouldn't be totally confident. I mean, one figure that I like to mention is that the annual income, well, this was a few years ago, but I shouldn't think it's that different. The annual income of Justin Bieber is greater than the annual income of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. That is a really sobering, distressing statistic, I think. But you know, the Berlin Philharmonic is going to carry on having an annual income long after Justin Bieber's career has ended, and indeed after he is completely forgotten, I would suggest. That's probably a very elitist thing to say, but so the second objection is, by the way, I think these objections, I mean, I'm interested in that objection, but it's the last one that I'm most interested in. Anyway, the second one, connotations of respectability. People think that if you regard jazz as, say, let's say America's classical music, or as a classical music, that makes it blandly respectable and therefore ignorable. So you're trying to legitimate it by association with Western art music. Now, I'm not trying to legitimate jazz. I don't think jazz needs legitimation. I mean, when Kant tried to legitimate reason, I don't think that he thought it's not an urgent practical need, you know, it's a philosophical, what's the word? Deduction, right? I mean, it's not, it's a philosophical issue. Yes, there's this jazz being produced and we're really not sure the value. We really need some criteria to tell us, is it any good? I mean, no, that's not what this is about at all. It's an explanation of why it's regarded rightly as good, perhaps. That might be what's... So my feeling about the second objection is that, well, you know, are you going to say this about King Lear, Monteverdi's Vespers, St. Paul's Cathedral, Turner's Rain, Steam and Speed? Are they blandly respectable and therefore ignorable? I don't think that any of the classics, they can be interpreted in that way. Yes, there can be recordings that make them like that, but that's not going to be what an interpreter is seeking to do. An interpreter is seeking to overturn the blandly respectable and therefore ignorable. Finally, this is the most, so I'll say a few more minutes about this. this question of allegedly static common practice. So if you say that jazz is a classical music, are you saying now that it's ossified, that it's become static? Now, it was a commonplace, maybe it still is, a commonplace of music history to say that there was an era of common practice in Western art music from roughly Bach to, well, Schoenberg. The tonal system of functional harmony, that's an era of common practice. I mean, was that, is one really saying that that was static? You know, I find that hard to believe. So, and let's think about, to justify that skepticism about the objection, let's think about the difference between a living art and a classical art. Now, I mean, it would be completely mistaken to think that classical music is a curatorial exercise. And I've said that the authenticity movement in early music can occasionally perhaps come across as. So I don't think that because something is a classical music, that it's ossified. And Parakelis argues here that rather than resuscitating corpses, the classical repertory keeps certain old works ever popular, ever present, ever new. It is an idea founded on reverence for the past, but not necessarily on a modern scholarly conception of history. Now, there's a lot more in Parakelis' article here. It's a very interesting article. And one of them is the fact that the classical performer has to have a broad, flexible technique with which they may perform anything from Bach to Brahms or Bartok. You know, it's not a kind of concern. There isn't the concern with scholarly authenticity. In a way, it's perhaps a little inauthentic, and that leaves space for the authentic performance movement, even of Brahms and, you know, more modern composers. Right? So I'm interested in this contrast with what is a classical art and what's the continuity between classical and new, because if you remember, I just earlier distinguished the three approaches, right? Early music. So you can think of jazz as paralleling classical music and having these three approaches. The mainstream, right? That's where the vast majority of work, or shall we say the largest part of the work goes on, which in jazz is called post-bop. Now there is, in contrast to that, early music, repertory performances, and avant-garde or new music. And the question is, what's the connection between those, you know, number 2 and number 3? And there has to be a connection. So the new music has to lead to, if it's a living art, if it's a living classical art, it has to be the case that the material from the new music avant-garde then does penetrate into the mainstream. It has to be a permeable barrier. In other words, it can't be, you know, an impermeable barrier. And then I just say at the end, I now realize my question is the same as, is jazz art or entertainment? Which is, you might think, what a stupid question. Of course, it can be both, but we need to explain what it means for it to be both. And I give a few hints or suggestions. I don't think entertainment has an essentially aesthetic end, and I don't think entertainment has a test of time. Those are two examples of differences. But, well, I haven't really, so I suppose what I've tried to do is defend the idea that jazz is a classical music, can be described as a classical music, and that you can describe it that way without threatening the values of jazz, though, you know, maybe, I'm not sure, maybe that's too optimistic. Maybe there's a price to pay. But I think the criticisms of this idea, of this concept, are too extreme in their in their conclusions. So I think that'll do. So that's 30 minutes. So I'll just stop the sharing of the screen.
Thank you very much, Andy, for this very interesting talk. And I guess there were many issues that need, or award further discussion. So you are happy to raise questions, and yeah, feel free to do so. Or I can also start, because I have actually, if there is nobody for the moment, we let people think. Okay, so I basically have 2 points, what you said, which are more like clarification in some sense. So the first one concerns your use of classical music or art music as some sort of evaluative term, right? I mean, that's what I got. So you are using the notion of classical music as a positive appreciative term in some sense, because we usually distinguish between, an evaluative way of using the term art or classical music, art music, and maybe a more descriptive one. So yeah, that would be the first clarification. And the second one is related. So the concept of canon seems, it's very interesting to me, and it seems also needed, of course, to argue what you want to argue. Although to me, it doesn't seem necessary. So the canon notion doesn't seem, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient to make something an art in this positive evaluative sense, right? So you can have, I don't know, a canon of sitcoms, I don't know, maybe Happy Days or Friends, they form some sort of canon, but this is arguably not enough to make them like a higher form of art that is different from mere entertainment, right?
Good.
So
yeah. Okay. Yes. On the first question, yes, I mean, I think art is part of human well-being. It's valuable, and so is entertainment. So in that sense, it's an honorific, or what did you call it? Evaluative? Did you say evaluative term? Or yeah, I think it's got to be that. I don't. So there are attempts to give a sociological analysis of art, like the art world theory by Dickey. And that is important. It's an important insight. I mean, that's a valuable insight, but it's not the complete picture. It's not the whole picture. That's all one can say, because one can raise the question whether something that's included in the canon by the art world is really that valuable. And in fact, I think a lot of people are too quick to put something in the canon. So that moves on to the second point, which is about a canon of entertainment. Now, I did say that there is classic entertainment. And in fact, there's also, I'm very interested in this category, classic light music or classic music, Now that's a very interesting category and there are things like Canadian Sunset, Summer Place. These are classics. Now, if I start saying these are classics of light music, you might think you're being satirical, I'm not sure what to think about them. They are very memorable, and there's some kind of classic status which they seem to be holding on to. So I don't think, so there's an interesting category of classic entertainment, but normally, but that doesn't mean that an entertainer can say, I'm not bothered about the audience now, I'm just thinking about there's something very curious about that they're thinking about that. So I have to be careful. I suppose I need to distinguish different senses of canon will be the usual philosophical maneuver. but you know, a canon of is there a canon of TV detective series? In a sense there is, but it's beginning to get a bit thin, the notion of a canon, because a canon is not just what's popular, a canon is what's valuable, right? So the canon of TV detective series, it's not just, I've here given a list of the most popular, most viewed detective series of the last 50 years or more, or however many years you want to go back. No, that would not be the canon. That would just be a list of, you know, in terms of popularity. The canon is saying something like, well, now there's something really special about Kojak for those who are old enough to remember that series as a TV series. That was a special, you know, but more likely something like The Wire, as, you know, that is meant to be a classic series, you know, but of course it's getting more into art, you know, then that's not just entertainment really. So anyway, that's a few points.
Yeah, thank you. I think what is also connected to this debate is the notion of genre. So when something becomes a genre, maybe it's more, you know, possible that it has a canon, or, you know, in order to have a genre, you need to have a canon. So if,
Yes.
maybe.
Okay. Yes, that's a good. Certainly, if something's an art form, there must be a canon. But if you say something's a genre, then you've got to say a genre of what? I mean, a genre of jazz is a genre. What's it a genre of? Music. Well, that's, you know. I agree. Yes. When something becomes, you can't talk about a genre without having paradigms, you know, which would be a kind of canon. But you have to be careful, you know. This I'm not really sure about this, but I'm inclined to say the canon is a mark of quality. So it's not just, I mean, a paradigm is a bit ambiguous, isn't it? A paradigm could just be, I mean, it could be something could be a paradigm because it's very easy to imitate. So you might say, I mean, I remember Oscar Peterson saying, you know, Nat King Cole's piano playing is very good to imitate if you're learning to play jazz, you know, and maybe it's a paradigm. Now, I think it's a paradigm in both senses. It's a paradigm because it's easier to imitate, perhaps, but it's also a paradigm because it is very high value art, you know, of that kind. So I agree, yes, but that's, I'm interested, this is useful to me because I'm trying to show that one can't talk about any of these terms in isolation, that there's a kind of nexus of terms. So if someone says, well, I'm going to define art, I'm not going to say anything about entertainment, well, that's not going to work. And if someone says, I'm going to define entertainment, but I'm not going to say anything about genres, again, that's not going to work because these all, or the canon, because you learn about what entertainment is by learning about the genres of entertainment and by perhaps learning about a canon, you know. So I agree, yes, these are interdefined concepts.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, it's like that. It's like a network of notions that are, you know, interweaving with each other. So questions from somebody? Yeah, I see Laurent.
Yes, thank you. If there is nobody else, yeah, okay. Thank you for this very interesting consideration. I would have two points this time. The first one about the question to know if jazz becomes an art music from bebop, following the Scott DeVoe consideration. I think that we should seriously revise this opinion because I think all the musicians before bebop, the jazz musicians were very conscious to be artists. I have one quotation that I looked for. That's by Garvin Bushell, who was a player in New Orleans in the 20s, maybe in the 1910s. And he said about the Dodds brother, Johnny Dodds and Baby Dodds, who played with Louis Armstrong. So Garvin Bushell is saying, they felt very highly about what they were playing, as though they knew they were doing something new that nobody else could do. I'd say that they regarded themselves as artists in the sense we use the term today. And probably there would be a lot of other this kind of testimony. So on the if we use this criteria of the consciousness of the musician, I think the people before bebop were highly conscious to be artists. And if we take the other criteria you mentioned, or Scott Durham mentioned, about commercialism, I think there was commercial constraints before and after bebop and during bebop, and that's a constant in the whole history of jazz. And I'm not sure that it's really a good criteria to evaluate this question. I'm not pretending that nothing happened with bebop. Of course, the excellent book of Scott Deveau about this passage from swing bebop shows that that was a very important change, but I'm not sure that this is really the point where jazz became an art. And the second point was a point I'm very interested in. I think that was point number 3 in the critique of the idea of jazz as in classical music. What you said about common practice, I think that's a very interesting point, because you can, that's a possible way to define classical music, as you said, I think. And I always have been very struck by the parallel. I'm among the people who think that jazz followed for some part the same path as classical music, European classical music. And what is really striking to me, that there is a common practice in jazz, as there is a common practice in classical music. As you said, in classical music, it's, let's say, 18th and 19th century, and in jazz, that is actually bebop. And what authorized to have this kind of idea is the jazz education system. If you go in a conservatory to learn classical music, you will start probably with Chopin and Schumann, and not with Monteverdi and not with Stockhausen. And once you have the fundamentals, you can play Chopin or Schumann. And if you want to play Stockhausen or Monteverdi, that's a following step. And that's exactly what happened with the education system in jazz. You first learn to play like Charlie Parker and Miles Davis, and after that, when you get the fundamentals, if you're interested to playing like Louis Armstrong or like I don't know, John Zorn, that's a second step. And to me, that's very striking, that this idea of common practice really gets shaped the same way in as in classical music. And maybe I agree with you that I don't like this critic to say that at some point the practice is freezed in a common practice and nobody changes it. That's not true, of course, in classical music. I mean European classical music, and that's not true either with jazz. But the point is that you have a reference period, and before you have a period of formation. It slowly goes to, in classical music, it took maybe 8 or 10 centuries from Middle Age and slowly to the tonality system. And it happened the same in jazz, even if the period, of course, are much shorter. But you have a period when it goes slowly until, let's say, to bebop, and then you have periods for kind of stability, let's say in the 50s and 60s, and afterwards in the 60s, like in the early 20th century for classical music, new things appear, and nothing is freezed, of course. But you have this period of reference, and maybe that's a way to define what is the classical music. That classical music would be, in that way, defined by a reference period with something before and something after. And that's all for now.
Good, thanks. On the question of, I mean, I suppose I'm that used to be a bit of a kind of Scott DeVoe's view was quite common, that bebop was the first time that jazz became a self-conscious art, and maybe it's less common, but don't you think that probably more bebop musicians thought of themselves as artists than in the case of New Orleans and swing? So I'm not denying that there were some people who did, but I'm also struck by the story about Duke Ellington. I mean, how true this is, I don't know, but that when he came to Europe, he was surprised that people regarded him as an artist. So Constant Lambert told him, you know, you're a composer, you know, you're a great composer. And this was news to him. Now, I don't know how true that is, that it was news to him. And anyone who is putting that kind of effort into crafting their music must know in some sense that they're an artist. But still, I think it's to do with the preponderance, isn't it? It's the fact that there weren't any bebop musicians who thought of themselves purely as entertainers, but there might have been musicians from an earlier era who did. So I'm not saying no jazz musicians thought of themselves as artists till bebop. I'm just saying, you know, till bebop, most musicians may not have thought of themselves as artists, although many did. I don't know what you think about that.
Yes, I think we should make a difference between how the people see themselves and how the other people see them. For example, with the example of Duke Ellington, I think, of course, you're right, that it was the environment was not the same. He was not regarded as an artist until maybe, I don't know, the 50s or the 60s. And then he was, but I'm quite convinced that he himself was looking at himself as an artist since the very beginning. Or maybe he was, of course, he was an entertainer too. But I think for himself, he knew that he was an artist. But anyway, maybe that's not such an important discussion. But I just think that we should be, yes, that probably more complicated. That thinking that it starts at a precise point somewhere, sometime around 1944 or 45. But of course, the environment is very much changing too. And if you ask to play at the Carnegie Hall, that's not the same. That's playing in a giant house in New Orleans in the 20s, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, so other questions or comments? Yeah, I see Leo's hands up. So Leo.
Yes, thank you very much. It's really interesting. I'm coming at this obviously from the musicologist's side of the fence, but it's been really interesting throughout this seminar to discover more the philosopher's side of things. And Lisa's helped us with that as well, and other presenters along the way. It's been great. One thing I'm really interested in, and this is coming from a perspective of being a musicologist and not knowing much about the philosophy side of it, is that this isn't the first time I've seen Adorno invoked as a protector of, or someone to advance this idea that jazz is an art music. And yet when we read Adorno, he thought jazz was like not worth the time of day, at least what I've read about him. And I'll quote from a book which I've been reading, or just finished reading, Jazz and the Philosophy of Art, which is by Lee B. Brown, David Goldblatt, and Theodore Grassic.
Oh, yeah.
In his article, Farewell to Jazz, they say it would have been forgotten about, that's Adorno's 1933 article, had he not continued to write about jazz, as if trying to drive a stake through the heart of a patient who refused to succumb to a terminal condition. Yes. Which I thought was great. But the point is that they go on to say that basically, according to their analysis of the way things stand, Adorno viewed jazz, and no matter what hard cases were put against it, for example, John Coltrane, A Love Supreme, these types of more artistic forms of jazz, he would always reply, oh yes, that's a non-conforming case, but en masse, it's a music for the masses, it's an entertainment, and thus it's a corrosive tool of social conformity and class exploitation. That's the first point I just wanted to make. Then moving to your use of the term classical music, which kind of pedals back to what Adorno was saying. Classical, in terms of musicology, is more and more frowned upon, as you probably no doubt know, in that even Western art music sometimes is, people are trying to take out the Western, at least in the United States, because just trying to go, you're probably aware of all this polemic that surrounds these terms, but it's becoming under increasing criticism, and classical music is more used as a term in mass culture. We have these, like, before record stores disappeared, there was the listening lounge at the back for the classical music at HMV, and everyone remembers that. And it's commodifying classical music in exactly the way that Adorno's critiquing jazz. So I just wanted your thoughts on those couple of comments.
Well, on Adorno, I mean, it's a long time since I've really looked at his writing on jazz, but as I recall, I mean, what I usually say is that he just misunderstands what jazz means. He is talking about, commercial dance band music. That's what he always means. And there are some writings from the 50s and 60s where he recognizes virtues in jazz, which suggests that perhaps he was listening a bit more widely. So the first thing I'd say is I would kind of defend him by saying, if you like, that he didn't really mean what is currently meant by jazz. Nonetheless, his listening habits are so narrow. You know, he is so, I mean, this is a real unfortunate, situation, but he didn't have much time for music outside the Austro-German tradition of, Western art music. So that's what I say about him. Now, on the question of, yes, I realized that even in the time in the 10 years since I first had this idea for this article or wrote a version of it, it's becoming impossible to say anything, isn't it? Well, it's becoming much harder for me to say anything, but I'm not, but undeterred, I will continue to say things. I mean, classical, this is the question of classical versus classic. Now, I don't see there's anything anyone can object to classic. They might object to classical. So I need to think about the connection between them. But if someone says, oh, you can't refer to classic X, because that's elitist, I'd say, oh, for goodness sake, just go away. It's not very interesting, very boring kind of, for the reasons that I've given, the numerous or the various reasons that I've given. As to why you might not, what's the problem with Western art music? That
I think it's the Western art music. If you followed this Philip Ewell controversy in Music Theory magazine in America, but anyway, it's becoming more and more. And in fact, Philippe Cattet has the same at the Sorbonne here, has the same reservations, even though I'm sure he doesn't agree with Philip Ewell about too much stuff there on. But he also says he doesn't like the Western in Western art music.
But what's the issue then? What should you call it? But he thinks that there's too much attention paid to Western art music.
Well, because I think Philippe Cattet, who I respect more than Philippe Ewell, is coming more from the point of view that you'd have to ask him, and he's sometimes here. Is he here today or no?
No, he's not.
But basically, I think, and if someone understands his work better than I do, please interject. But I think he's coming at the view that music, like all things, Western music included, was not just a product of the West. It had influences from the Moors and from various other places throughout history. And so he's looking at a more global vision of the way music was happening in a particular place at a particular time.
Yes, that's right. The word Western, that is. Well, what if I say North American and European? I mean, well, that would at least, that might have some advantages, although it has disadvantages.
Yeah, perhaps.
How do you spell Ewell? Is it?
Oh, Ewell.
Okay, so that's something I should know about then, because I'm gonna.
Yeah.
Really,
look him up.
I need to do, because I'm gonna be caught out. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
They're buzzing about him in the United States.
Oh, what a pity. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Leo. Thank you, Andy. Are there any other questions? We have 3 minutes before 7 p.m. or 6 p.m. in Andy's time. If not, I thank you, Andy, and you all again for a very nice discussion and talk, and Matteo, so I can see him again. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation, for coming here, for talking and discussing. It was very interesting, and we'll see each other in 2 weeks. If you want, you're all welcome. Laurent knows better than me what the schedule is, because I forgot this, but otherwise,
yes.
Okay,
The last question from Leo was gives a perfect transition, since the next 2 sessions of the webinar will be the last one of the semester, will be about Adorno and popular music. So in 2 weeks from now, we'll have 3 scholars. The form of the session will change a little. We won't have 2 interventions, but we will have 3 scholars talking together about the same topic, which is Adorno and classical music. So in 2 weeks, it will be Christian Béthune, who wrote a book about that in French some time ago, and Johanna Desplat-Roger, who is a young philosopher working on Adorno and music, and Vincenzo Caporaletti, the creator of the theory of audiotactile music, who wrote an article about this. So they will talk together and with us, I hope, about this topic. And in 4 weeks from now, we will have the same kind of session, but with Anglophone people, among them Lydia Geur, who honors us with welcoming to have the same kind of discussion about Adorno music with 2 other scholars, and I don't remind their names now. Maybe Lisa, you remember it. Anyway, yes, yeah. Lisa.
Stefano Marino for sure.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
Okay, so thank you again for being there. Thank you, Andy. And
can I just ask?
Yeah.
I mean, can students of mine attend this seminar? I mean,
of course.
It's open.
Yes, it's absolutely open to anybody. Yeah.
The link is always
okay. Well, I'll just.
Yeah.
The link is always the same.
French. Yeah. That's the only thing. Sometimes it's in French.
In 2 weeks it'll be in French, will it?
Yes.
Okay.
And in 4 weeks it will be in English.
Okay. Right. Thanks a lot, then.
Yeah, you're welcome. And we'll go on also next year, so we'll have sessions.
Okay.
For next year, half in French, half in English, or Brazilian, Italian. We are trying to be very inclusive with languages. Okay, so thank you all again.
And thank you, everybody.
Nice evening, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's great. Thank you.
Ciao.
Au revoir. Au revoir.